with us?
We will. We certainly are. People are still joining us, and I'm having a wonderful catch up, can I say, with Professor Mary Kalantzis and Dr. Bill Cope. And I noticed that my friend Apollo, who I met, of course, when I recently visited you, is right there in the middle, and he's had a haircut. Oh, he's adorable. Bill and Mary, I really can't thank you enough, but let me start formally with all the, the catch-ups that we just had a little moment ago. But good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to what I know will be an incredibly special event. My name's Maria Demopoulos. I'm the CEO of the Settlement Council of Australia, as I like to say, the best organisation in the world. It's wonderful to see colleagues joining us from around the country. And I was saying to Bill and Mary, because it was such a kind of immediate thing and we were working time zones out, we only ended up having about really a week, and in a week we've managed 100 registrations, so you can imagine with a little bit more lead up, there's so much interest. But look, before we begin, let me start, of course, by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands from which we're all joining on around the country. I'm here on the lands of the Boonwurrung Bunurong people. I want to pay my respects to elders past and present, and of course extend that respect to any First Peoples that might be joining us today. For those of us working in the settlement space, we know that this acknowledgement is a lot more than just a formality. We really are trying to ensure that there is genuine investment in this conversation around what I think is unfinished business. If I could ask people to turn their mics off, that would be great, folks. Look, I am going to just introduce the topic and then introduce Bill and Mary, but I was going to go back to that question the conversation, Bill, that you and I were just having a moment, if you don't mind. But today's conversation is part of SCOA's commitment to really strengthening the intellectual and policy foundations of the settlement sector. And as you know, the Settlement Council of Australia is the national peak body representing more than 170 organisations working across our sector. Our members work on frontline, of course, supporting refugees and migrants, navigating their way through the complex settlement journey. But as settlement agencies, we really do sit at the front line of Australia's multicultural project. Every day, I'd argue, our sector is engaged in the practical work of building belonging, navigating cultural difference, supporting democratic participation, strengthening social cohesion, etc., etc. And right now, what many of you around the room are saying is this feels particularly urgent. And many of you have reflected back to SCOA the need to kind of almost revisit some foundational starting points as we move towards an opportunity to address what some of you are saying is a bit of a crisis out there. So how do we as a sector really understand those foundations, but just as importantly, build a unified response to some of the increasing concerns that our communities and our sector are articulating more and more. So I think it is at these moments the opportunity through conversations like this to really take a step back, to pause, to reflect on the history of multiculturalism, because I always think it's a living history. It's not something that just gets packed away. It's something that continues to inform just about every part of our work. And that's the spirit of today's conversation. Now, I'm going to introduce Bill and Mary, not that they need any introduction whatsoever, except to say that I did start just before we invited everybody else around by saying how much I miss them. I miss them terribly. Mary was, in fact, the reason I started a PhD, but I stopped because she left me. She left me, folks. I really want to say this. And I could not continue a PhD without the calibre of Professor Mary Kalantzis supervising me. So, Mary, when you come back, I will resume that PhD. But I did want to ask both of you, Professor Kalantzis, Bill Cope, you've spent decades looking at cultural diversity, how societies respond to it. You continue to do it, of course, but now in the United States. But your work really did frame some very significant and important conversations about multiculturalism. And Mary, you were saying before, as a structural project, as a nation building project. And many of us in the sector are fully across your concepts, your ideas, ranging from, of course, productive diversity through to multiliteracies, through to the idea of pluralist societies. I could go on and on and on. If you've got 3 days, folks, spend some time reviewing their CV. But at a time right now, I think, where migration policies, multiculturalism, sadly, public discourse, language is being weaponised, it's intensifying. Your insights right now are what people wanted. They wanted to reflect on some of those fundamentals. But I asked you the question just before of why did you leave? And I mean this quite seriously. And Mary, you started by saying it was Pauline Hanson that drove you away. And Bill, you talked about the devastation around the unfinished business with First People. So I do just want to start, if I could, informally, just to get the conversation started. And of course, we will launch into some of the more formal questions that we have for you. But just hello, welcome back. When are you coming back?
Well, hello to everybody who's here. We're wonderful to see so many people, perhaps people we know and friends along the way. It is, we feel Australian, and it's wonderful to be among Australians tonight. Bill.
Yeah, no, great to be back. Great to be back. I mean, back virtually, that is.
And by the way, Maria, you can do your PhD online anytime. The digital world is upon us.
It's not the same, Mary. It was the conversations over dinner, over your amazing Greek cooking. That's what I miss.
Okay. Bill.
Yeah, so I mean, what can I say? We've been here for 20 years now, which is kind of unbelievable in a way.
We came for 3.
But we're just as connected. I mean, Maria will tell you that in our garage we have an incredible Australian history library, and we do have it. We are writing this kind of comprehensive history of Australia from 2 perspectives, actually. One is the immigrant perspective, and the other is the Aboriginal perspective, because there are no other stories, right? We've been working on that for a whole lot of time, and every now and then we get back to it, and we intend to finish it. So, our PhDs were in history, Australian history. We've ended up here in the US. One of the things is the kind of work we do. There are US universities are pretty fantastic places to be. The country's a strange place to be, to put it mildly, but we don't feel like that doesn't matter to us a great deal. But we do feel very connected to Australia and we have a kind of a deep knowledge of Australia and a commitment to Australian history. But it's also, for me, one of the reasons why I feel like I can't be there as well. I'm quite happy to be, I'm a stranger in someone else's country. I'm glad I'm a stranger here. I wouldn't want to be anything other than a stranger. And Australia kind of has these visceral disappointments, if you like, which means it's harder. I think it would be harder for us to live there than here. It's not that we aren't still connected.
You didn't explain what they were, Bill. I mean,
the visceral disappointments.
We were heavily recruited, by the way. We said no.
Right.
No.
And look, we
were heavily recruited.
It's a great university, and we've had great opportunities here, which we wouldn't have had in Australia for funding and research.
So what was your
all right. So what was I doing? I think at the end of the 90s. There was incredible opportunity for Australia to become a different kind of place. And it kind of did become a different kind of place, almost. And that was the Republic. That was the vision of multiculturalism as genuine pluralism, a different type of civics, which Mary wrote about a lot. But also the Aboriginal stuff makes Australia such an exciting, incredibly interesting place. Australia has a set of resources there for understanding the nature of humanity, which no other country has. In the US, there's Native Americans, but honestly, it's a much longer history of colonization and in a way even more devastating than Australia. So, you know, that mix, and also being in Asia, what a great set of tensions to be in this dynamic region. And people know that I worked in the Keating government at the very end of the Keating period. And, you know, I'm just an unreconstructed version of, you know, the Paul Keating ideology, which that was a great moment. And the thing too is that I don't think Howard, he wanted to undo the whole damn thing.
In fact, he commissioned you to undo the whole thing.
And also he didn't.
Yes, but you had to close the Office of Multicultural Affairs. ATSIC was put away. The immigration unit was put away. You were charged with closing.
So I was the head of those things when they got closed.
I should have warned everybody that if you assumed agreement between Bill and Mary, you would be very wrong. An invitation to go to dinner with Bill and Mary is to enjoy them arguing endlessly.
No, actually beforehand, by the way, and I said this to Mary beforehand, I said to Mary, what am I allowed to say? Because we kind of disagree on so many damn things. And I said, I better keep the party line consistent. Right.
We stood in the office of ATSIC with all the drawers undone, with all material on the ground. We stood in the office of the Multicultural Affairs, again, abandoned. It was
let me tell you this. Actually,
like in a war, and they had thrown everything away. It was heartbreaking.
The Bureau of Immigration Research did fabulous research in the 80s and 90s. And
this was BIMPR, of course, which was a massive data collection program, and that's something we talk about now. How much do we miss it? Yeah,
right. But also the Office of Multicultural Affairs under Peter Shergold commissioned a lot of reports. So this was a period of really deep thinking. Now, here's a very nice thing. When they left, I took 2,500 reports
in our garage,
and they're in our garage in Illinois. If anyone wants to know, and I have them all catalogued, by the way.
He has. I've seen them.
I took them because they were all going to be thrown out, right?
Yeah.
And so what they were is on every ethnic community you want to name, on immigration and population issues. This is an incredible knowledge bank, an incredible kind of intellectual powerhouse trying to think through what a different kind of country would be. So anyhow, I was the director of each of those things when they closed, of OMA, then BIMPR. And then I brought the 2,500 reports with us here as a kind of historical archive, because they're all going to be thrown out. So if anybody wants them, I have a catalogue of them all. And by the way, this was pre-digitisation. So these are all grey reports, which, you know, have probably been completely lost because it was digitisation didn't start.
And ATSIC went at the same time.
ATSIC went too. So, yeah.
So that left a mark on us. However, I just want to remind people, I want to say something that I sort of was thinking about. Nations and nation building was what Bill and I have always been interested in, whether it's at the public level, policy level, at the education level. And Australia, as a modern Western colonial country, is evolving still, right? It's evolving still. It has unfinished business with Indigenous people, which is most recently mucked up horribly, right? And it's left a great stain, but it remains one of the key unfinished businesses. The first thing it did when it became a nation was to say white and British and smooth the dying pillow. That's in the consciousness, in the DNA of what it is to be Australia. And it was in 1948 that we became citizens, right? Think about it. 1949 that we got passports. So all that time we thought we were British, and that remains in our parliament.
They're all still British because they've got a Union Jack up there in the corner of the flag.
I haven't finished. He's interrupting me. In our parliament, we had parliamentarians who would come from Britain as immigrants, and they would decide what we'd be. So we have that continuous thing at the moment, which is playing out now about what kind of immigrants are here.
King Charles.
But after the Second World War, when the Japanese attacked Australia, Australia, they realised, as you all know, populate or perish. Right. So they wanted the British to come, but of course there weren't enough British. So they went to war-torn Europe and to those places that were suffering and encouraged, invited my parents, your parents, other people's parents to come to Australia to work on the land, to be labourers, to help build the country. And of course, when the economic miracle happened in 1970 in Europe, a lot of those people were not happy, and the Galbally report reported that. They didn't feel they belonged, so they packed up their cultural capital and went to Europe. So then Australia thought, oh dear, what are we going to do? And that's where they borrowed that idea of multiculturalism originally from Canada, right? But it was about, and initially you might remember, we were critical. We don't want spaghetti and pulp of multiculturalism, because initially it was about that. Let's have our parties. Let's be different in colourful kind of ways. And many of us reacted against that. So no, the nation building exercise needs to focus on resources, infrastructure, a story about who we are, right? We need a narrative about who we are. And we say we're egalitarianism, but we gave up on that. The fair go, egalitarianism, being ecumenical. These are concepts that have been strong in Australia's history, very strong, right? But we sort of let them fray, and we played football with the word multiculturalism for a long time. However, it evolved and it grew, like the Settlement Council, like SVS, like the Human Rights Commission, a whole range of entities and infrastructures were put into place. They are permanently there, and they say something about Australia. They define who we are as a people, and we need to be proud of that, because it is about an inclusive sociality, right? And we might need to find other words of describing that inclusive sociality. But the people who are going to come here and keep building Australia, in 1901, they wanted 1% growth every year. Now we're getting 2.3%, I think, from immigration. But they're not going to come from, they're going to come from all over the world, right? But they're all human beings, and we have set up in Australia, and you guys continue, those infrastructure items that will help them settle, that will help them contribute and contribute to what we call productive diversity, because the linguistic and cultural attributes that they have help Australia genuinely, economically, as well as culturally, connecting us with the rest of the world. That's the story we need to be telling, not just about the spaghetti and polka, right? And whenever we move back to spaghetti and polka, we get attacked, right? And yet Australia, unlike any other country, has managed enormous immigration, enormous demographic change peacefully, right? And productively. And we need to name that. And ecumenical too. The faith is a private thing. It's not a state-run thing. We're not going to have Sharia law tomorrow just because we have a lot of people who believe in that. But people will take those small things about culture, amplify them, and create, unnecessary misinformation about them.
So, Mary, can I ask you? Sorry,
if I can finish, is we have a strong story. We have a good story about nation building, which is evolving still, and particularly the sorest point is the Indigenous. What happened with the vote with the Indigenous people, because that set us back a long way. Having the king still there, we're still not a republic. There's some things that we have to work on, which are really, really important. Sorry, you were going to say something.
No, not at all, because I do want to take you back then to the point of settlement as infrastructure. It is a proposition that obviously we are trying to develop a stronger narrative around going forward. At the time, you both coined the idea, Mary, productive diversity. I think there was a lot of misunderstanding at the time of what it was. A lot of people assumed it was an attempt to monetize multiculturalism, that it was an attempt to simply put an economic frame around it. But my understanding always in the conversations that I had with you was that institutional transformation, that we needed to understand multiculturalism as more than the spaghetti and polka dots, polka, dances. It was actually about really solidifying this idea of nation building. But can you just unpack the idea behind productive diversity? Because interestingly, it's 3 times in the last 2 months I've heard it come out of a couple of high-level senior sort of policy people, and I thought, oh, this is interesting. But is it because the sort of structural ambition's been realised now and that's why? Or is productive diversity dead and buried? Is there, so 2 things really, a bit more clarity around what was the intent when you coined that, and is the relevance still there?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll
diversity is an asset, not a negative, right?
Right,
and
yeah.
you have to draw upon the diversity for cultural, economic, and social reasons. Bill, go ahead.
So the origin of that phrase was actually the industry restructuring in the Keating period, right? So it was actually about how one builds something positive around a workforce which is diverse. Is it just a problem because we've got to do English language classes, or there's communication problems in the workplace because of people with different languages and different cultural experiences and whatever? And it was to try and turn that around as a set of positives, which is in a global world, these diasporic connections are powerful and useful. Variations in the way one perspectives and ways in which one thinks are a positive thing in terms of teamwork. So it really came out of an industrial context in the industry restructuring in the Labor government, right? Now, you might say that's economic rationalism of sorts, but in a way to have a solid set of economic rationales for multiculturalism is a good thing. In other words, the other aspects of multiculturalism, of course, are the cultural stuff we like, all the restaurants and all that kind of stuff, the cosmopolitan kind of feel of things. That's okay, that's fine. The other aspect is a whole lot of welfare things like multilingual services in human services of all kinds and so on. So we know all those things. There's a welfare issue, there's an identity issue, but the economic issue actually then gives it a kind of another level of, it's a complete picture actually. It gives it another level of seriousness. Now, what's interesting is if you look at the mainstream business literature now about organizations and change management and all that kind of stuff, it's now a commonplace that that having diverse perspectives is a good thing. It's now regarded as a commonplace. So I don't regard it as a deficiency that it has a kind of an economic rationalist edge to it. And the book that we wrote back in '98, the Productive Diversity book, was actually to try and document that and to give it a kind of a sense of seriousness.
But it also went to services. Like if you have diversity and you want it to be productive, you have to ensure they have the services that enable them, to settle successfully, to get jobs, to be recognized, to participate. So it had that civic component as well. It was never just, and again, it's about thinking, it is about thinking of yourself as a nation. What kind of nation? Like, you all know that 50% of your population, our population in Australia, has one parent born overseas or are themselves born overseas. Now, in that context, that will continue to be the case. And that can be, that we regarded that as a global asset as well as a national asset. But for it to be a true asset, you needed policies, you needed recognition, you needed participation, you needed that had to happen as well. Otherwise, people will form ghettos or just kind of work with outside of their country. Again, it's what kind of a country are we going to be, and what common democratic values do we have? the values of a fair go, the values of sharing, the values of negotiation. We do need a common set of cultural things that we talk about, right? I started earlier by saying egalitarianism, a fair go, ecumenical, right? We need to say we're proud of that. We're proud of being those things, and it means we're not killing each other. We're not, we're growing together, and we're a model for the rest of the world. Because the rest of the world is also becoming very anxious about migration that doesn't fit some traditional norm. But Australia has been, what it did in relation to South Africa was fantastic when it supported, the end of apartheid.
Martin Fraser.
And, that was a really important role. And Australia still, I think, can be a beacon in the rest of the world in its nation building exercise if it gets rid of the king. you have to get rid of royalty.
One aspect of this, a kind of a real material basis problem, if you like, at the moment, is the Australian antipathy to Asia. So what, the idea that Australia should be as hostilely opposed to China as the United States is, it's just ridiculous. I heard a very good podcast by John Menadue the other day, who was just lamenting the fact that Australia doesn't have a consciousness of being part of Asia. And that's a material thing, by the way. It's simply the fact that you folks drive Chinese cars, which are illegal in the United States. The fact that you folks export the steel to make the Chinese cars, and that Australia benefits hugely in a material way from these direct economic relations with Asia, yet thinks that its cultural, political and military alliances with the United Kingdom, goodness me, with the United States, and we can see the United States kind of doesn't really give a damn about Australia, to be quite frank. So, one of the things is a consciousness. I remember going to, clearly in my mind, right before the 96 election, Keating came to Townsville, and I was A, working for Keating, but B, we were living in Townsville at the time, and he went to a pub in South Townsville. I remember how clearly he was saying there, look, we have to be part of Asia. We have to think north, because that's where that's where our economic future is. And that means that we have to have a sort of set of cultural alignments with that.
Well, actually, Bill, when we were young academics there, Australia was the first country to go into Asia, the education system. We were right there before anybody else. We went to Shanghai, to Beijing. We set up community colleges. We worked with universities. Australia was the first.
Whitlam's recognition of China as well.
And it was,
was the head of Nixon.
And Indonesia and Malaysia, and we were going north. That's where our future was, collaborating.
And Malcolm Fraser even countenancing such a large refugee program from at the end of the Vietnam War. I mean, they were all very big things, by the way, and that's a lot of that.
But they're things, foundational things in nation building for the identity of the country that need to be
is it still there? I mean, this is the point now, and I am going to open it up to some questions, because I know that was the draw card, really, is to get to say and put a direct question to the two greats. But obviously right now, because we're trying to make this connection between the foundational stuff that was going on in those kind of glory decades, can I say, to a time where for many of us it now feels like multiculturalism is under pressure. We've got, some really quite strong right-wing anti-immigration views that are being expressed and gathering a lot of support along the way. Many democracies around the world are seeing this kind of polarization in terms of political sort of thought. So if you were going to talk to us right now, at the moment that we're in Australia, what are the things we can take forward? What are the ways in which we can take the lessons of history and really present a solid front to this
Well,
onslaught. It's feeling like an onslaught for many
Yeah.
people. Yeah.
but it is. It's one of the habits of Australia to look to America when it wants to develop some wedge politics.
Right.
And unfortunately, it's happened before.
Yeah.
Wedge politics. America does it very well. Separate people, get them to divide each other. And right now, the Trumpian agenda, which seems to have captured the hearts and minds of so many people, is seen opportunistically as something that can play out in other parts of the world. And unfortunately, there are elements in Australia who are on about power and control of resources, who see this as an opportunity and are arguing in that line. But again, you have to go back to how has Australia become a nation? What are the components of it? What do you have to protect? You have to protect that diversity, but not just at the superficial level, and not just on the basis of they don't have the same religion as me, or they're going to hurt me. Look, you've hardly had any crisis in Australia. There was Cronulla, there was Bondi, but over all these years, you've been able to put in place the kind of conditions which allow the people who have joined to become Australian, to live decent lives and to cooperate. And that's got to be held on to. It really needs to be held on to. And I think you come back to those core values of egalitarianism, fair go, ecumenical orientation to faith, because that's one of the things that's been used. We're a Christian nation, and anything else will undermine us. So the narrative has to be the same. And the word multicultural might not just work exactly right now. You might need to find some broader words, because the people who are beating that term are misrepresenting it. They're taking the multi, they're taking the culture, and they said, well, what transcends? What makes us cohere? So we have to have values that cohere. And we just got to find the language and the narrative to make that work. But we can't do it without addressing the Indigenous issue, because that is an Achilles heel.
Yeah, Mary and I were talking about this before, and I'm less ambivalent about the word multiculturalism. Mary's ambivalent about the word multiculturalism and says, well, maybe we need to create a new word which describes.
No, not create, add language to it. Add language.
Right. In a way, that historical achievement, which is now, the word was brought to Australia by Al Grasby in a speech in 1973. So it's a word which has been in circulation now. What are we now? 73. 50-something years. So, I think it's important to stick to that as a historical set of achievements of those decades, the decades immediately after that. So, it was, frankly, the Labor Party in the Whitlam period were, Grasby was actually an unusual person, and there were a lot of people who were really, really deeply opposed to the idea, very deeply opposed to Asian immigration, and it really didn't become a real word until Petro Georgiou and Malcolm Fraser. And Petro Georgiou is a very thoughtful person, and Malcolm Fraser is a political person, then gave that word legs. And they gave it legs, by the way, through settlement services, exactly what you're doing now. And what they did was incredibly interesting, actually. What they did is they broke apart the traditional notion of the welfare state, which was universal services, same one size fits all. And they said, no, we're going to give grants to ethnic communities to self-manage nursing homes and self-managed services. Now, that's actually, in terms of the development of liberal democracy everywhere in the world, that's a really radical idea, because the fundamental idea behind liberal democracy is universality, right? And that universality always cuts out anybody who's not part of a norm. And so what Fraser and Galbally did in those years, so I'm only going to give Grasby credit for bringing a word into the country, because the Labor Party would not have a bar of it. But what they did in the late 70s was actually build a completely different model of the state, in which some of the state's activities could be delegated to communities, and the communities could manage those state welfare activities semi-autonomously in their own right. That's a radical idea. Now, I want to tell you as well, the ATSIC idea was a work of absolute genius. And the fact that that fell apart is another tragedy. So that was about, regional self-government for Indigenous communities, right? Now, and for me, by the way, the voice referendum was tragic at two levels. Tragic because it failed, but tragic because even before it failed, in that it was such a kind of a superficial kind of thing compared to what ATSIC was. And, if I thought imaginatively and retrospectively, if you could mix, if you could have mixed ATSIC with a sovereign wealth fund, right? So, people might know Norway has a sovereign wealth fund. Saudi Arabia has a sovereign wealth fund, which is basically all the money that came out of those lands, Aboriginal lands, was devoted to Aboriginal health, education, and housing, right? And you could have linked that onto ATSIC. You would have had another. So what you had with ATSIC was actually a brilliant piece of social design. But without adequate resourcing. But all you need to do is kind of link it with sovereign wealth, and then you would have a way to absolutely fundamentally shift the needle. And by the way, look, I'm going to say something which is going to upset a few people, which is that's pretty much more important than welcome to country. Right, that'll upset people. That's real. Welcome to country. I mean, I often feel, honestly, and I'm going to be, people are going to be upset with me. I often feel as if it's tokenistic. If it doesn't come with real activity and real resources in terms of culture, education, health, it's tokenistic. And it makes me always feel awkward, to be quite frank. So that's me. That other people were going to disagree with me vehemently, but I'm just saying what I feel in terms of what the possibilities for Australia were. The Aboriginal issue was actually easily solved. Regional self-government plus sovereign wealth, you've solved the problem.
But again, we don't necessarily learn the lessons of history. Look, I am going to open it up, if it's all right, for any questions. I'm hoping that you're both okay about that. At some point, I want to go back, Mary. I think I'd asked you this about the next generation kind of model of civic pluralism. If you thought that we could take that forward, is that a different way of kind of articulating multiculturalism? But if I don't ask participants questions, they're going to absolutely sort of rebel on me. There's a few hands. Margarita Coppolino, hello. So can I ask you, though, to not make lengthy commentaries, but ask questions, because it really is quite an opportunity. It's not often that Bill and Mary stay up this late.
She's my Facebook friend.
There you go, Margarita.
Yeah. Go ahead, Margarita.
So great to see you, Bill and Mary. I do miss not having you here in Australia. Please come home. Anyway, I'll just sort of put that in as well. The more of us say it, the more you might just do it. Look, I'm curious. You talked about Trump and the impact Trump's having. It'll be really good for you to touch on, particularly what's happening with the UN. What impact that's going to have on state parties to address cultural diversity, etc., etc.
Well, you know that Trump has banned diversity and has called universities dens of woke and communism and, the very engines of American well-being. Like Abraham Lincoln was in the middle of a war with blood all around him, and he set up the universities of America, the land grants, and said these are going to be the engines of the future. And this government, because educated people don't vote for Trump, supposedly, I'm not sure, I don't know how true that is, but anyway, he thinks that's where they have to be undone. They have to be undone this moment. So words, they had a list of words, and if you had any one of these words in your grants or in your courses, your money was taken away from you. It's using positional power like a god or a king. There are no restraints, no constraints at all. It's the most unusual moment to be in this country. I never thought I'd be anywhere where one human being through.
No, I can say, you got to hear what I've got to say about that, which is nearly the opposite, right? So predictably, but let Mary finish first.
Yes.
So you can agree with one of us.
Yes, you can agree.
You won't agree with both of us.
Yes, but it is, the university system is under attack. You know that. I don't have to tell you that. You read it in the newspapers. The lawyers are under attack. Any of them who have opposed him, they're gone. Anything that upsets him in any way gets punished. Anthropic, you just saw that, the digital model that was there. If it didn't do exactly what he wanted, he's going to kill it. So when do you have something
actually,
that
look,
operates
you've got to
like
let
that?
me start giving the alternative.
Oh,
it's now the #1 app, right? So what you have is that the idea, you know, this is a very divided country. I think, why did Trump get elected? I don't think it's because people are particularly bad. I think the white working class was just really pissed off, really upset, and just vote for chaos. And so, you know, some of the people who are ideologically committed to Trump, a lot of people who voted for him are just simply people who are traumatized and upset in all sorts of ways. And so, you know, there's a way of explaining what it is. I also think that his position is very, very fragile, to be quite frank. So I'm not going to, you know, this, like, you know, I think, well, this crazy war in Iran now is really kind of crazily ill-conceived. Almost every American war for the last 30, 40 years has been crazily ill-conceived, but this one happens to, I think, takes the cake. So one of the things is, I think it's very fragile. He has barely a majority in the Congress. It's probably going to get wiped out next year. I think just because he, you know, the Epstein thing plus the tariffs becoming a farce. The war was just something to do. So I think it's all a sign of incredible fragility amongst the MAGA people. One of the fascinating things about the MAGA people is their own splits. I don't know whether people are interested in watching it, but watch Tucker Carlson. Really interesting. A very, very right-wing person, and watch what he says now. You know, very, very complicated. So, you know, I think this place...
Bill, it's the abuse of positional power.
No, I think the abuse is very, very superficial, is what I'm saying. And even, you know, like, and I think there are a whole lot of institutional checks and balances. Now, one complicated thing I'd like to say, actually, is this is actually something that's missing in Australia. So what's missing in Australia is
the checks and balances.
Rigorous constitutionalism is missing in Australia. And one of the things that I followed very closely, because I knew him well, I went to every one of Andrew Theophanus's cases, and he still hasn't been exonerated. I went to visit Andrew Theophanus in jail, right, a number of times. One of the things I decided from that is that Australia is just shamefully lacks constitutionalism. It was arbitrary work, arbitrary setups which did it. And none of that would have survived the American legal system. So crazily, this right-wing Supreme Court overruled Trump's greatest triumph. So, you know, one of the things which I like about this place is a more rigorous constitutionalism than there is in Australia. And of course,
because we still don't even have a Human Rights Act, of course. I mean, it's constant reference here in Australia.
And there is human rights here. But by the way, the other thing is, Mary and I went to the big rallies we went to the big rally in New York City. We happened to be in New York City at the time, and the No Kings rally, it was called No Kings. And you folks have got a king. There were in New York City, there were 500,000 people.
How conveniently you've become non-Australian, Bill. It used to be you on this side. Careful there.
No,
hey, look, just on that though, on the fragility, because there's a couple of questions in the chat. Poor leadership, multiculturalism worked because it was bipartisan, and there was a certain level of respect. Now, politicians are the ones that are leading the division rather than actually calling for unity. They're the ones actively kind of feeding the division. So from that perspective, is it fragile in Australia as well? I mean, you've just said, look, but is the difference that it becomes a little more dangerous in Australia because we don't actually have the constitutional protections. We don't have a Multicultural Act. We don't have a Human Rights Act.
Maria, The
Yeah.
one more thing, when you were here when the vote was going on,
Yes,
and remember, I was speaking to my granddaughter in Australia, grown-up
Yes.
granddaughter, and I said, "How are you guys going to vote?" And they said, "We're going to vote no, the whole family." I said,
Yeah.
"Why?" He says, "Because they're just crooks in Parliament. They're
Yeah.
all crooks." So there's this idea that the people who choose to go into Parliament are unworthy, that they're crooks. So we've got to get a different kind of person who's going there. You know,
Yeah.
we have to kind of encourage people or ourselves make the sacrifice as decent people to go into government, because I think in America and in Australia, the people who are there are not trusted. They're not trusted because they're not looking after us. Like the housing situation in Australia, for instance, when no young person can buy a home in Sydney or Melbourne or any of the main cities. How can that be allowed to happen? You know, why isn't the government building more houses? Why isn't it enabling
And of course, you know,
people to have a good life?
that's a flashpoint, because when you've got such a large immigration program, well, you know, it's a flat. Housing is a flashpoint. So
Blame the immigrants.
that's blame the immigrants. Yeah.
Hello, Nevada.
Hi, Varvara. You've got your hand up, eh? Go for it, Varvara. You've got your hand up. And can I encourage people who've got questions? We've got about 10 minutes left. Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Hi, Mary and Bill. We miss you very much. Thanks, Maria. Now, I just want to ask Bill to expand a little bit more on his universality idea, because I can see a link between that and inclusion in Australia that followed. And I'm just interested in your comments, whether you view this as the way forward, or to me, it's problematic because a lot of people think that they're inclusive, but they're not. They're not. And inclusion cannot exist without diversity. I'm just interested in your views in relation to that. Thank you.
Okay, so look, I'm going to give a very practical answer. When I was working in Canberra, I'd started working on this thing called the Charter of Public Service for a Culturally Diverse Society, because what OMA did, it had to work with all government departments to create access and equity plans. So I tried to build a framework for that. And interestingly, when the government changed, I worked with Ruddock, and a person who's probably now not forgotten, a woman by the name of Anne Duffield, who was Ruddock's chief of staff. And we actually get this thing through together. So the idea was behind that depending on the intensity of the relationship, you needed to know more and more about the person. Okay, so if it was catching a bus, you didn't need to know much about their identity. But when it came to surgery or children in school, you need to know a lot. So we built a framework around language, around religion, because around food protocols, for example, around language, which is first language spoken, and language abilities. So what we did, we took a number of dimensions. So what that means is then inclusion doesn't mean one size fits all. It means tailoring services to these multiple dimensions. Now, what we then did is I don't know if people remember the NESB as a category, and the Nesbians. So we said we're going to get rid of that category because it's actually isolating a particular group on one variable, right? Because there are these other variables which are pretty important. So we created this idea of cultural diversity, and CALD it was called. Now, unfortunately, CALD then became a synonym for NESB. That's never what we meant. What we meant was that in any service, you've got to have a way of first measuring the degree to which it's even an issue. Like with a bus, driving a bus, the relationship between the driver and the passengers is not intense, it's not long-term, it's not terribly serious, so you don't have to do much, right? But with some things, you have to do a hell of a lot on these various dimensions. So then what inclusion means, now the classical idea of the welfare state was we provide everybody generic services, which is basic levels of income, basic levels of health, so the idea of the welfare state appears to be an egalitarian idea, which is we're going to give the same to everybody because that's justice and that's equality. But in fact, our argument was actually the quite different, which was no, the only way to achieve comparability is to treat people differently, right? And the outcome has to be comparable, but in a different way. So in other words, I go in and I have surgery, people interact with me in my language, they give me appropriate food in terms of my religious beliefs, and I come out healthy. But I only came out healthy because I was treated differently.
Right. And also, you said something about the next generation. I think the way we educate our children really matters, because none of you here that are here, or me or Bill, ask God or some superior power to be born in Greece, in Australia, black, white. We didn't ask for that, right? So we have no reason to either be proud or ashamed of what fate handed us, right? To be Greek, Italian, Aboriginal, whatever. No. And yet we focus on that, be proud or be ashamed or whatever. What we have to be proud and ashamed of is how we treat each other, the choices we make in relation to each other. It's a different way of understanding how you deal with diversity. It's not just, I'm Italian, we're the best, I'm Greek, we're the best, we're Aboriginal, we're the best. You know, we have this kind of ethnocentric kind of way of understanding our fate, right?
I'm going to say something.
And the fate and our fate is not our choice,
right.
But how we treat each other is our choice. And we need to, our children need to understand that the choices they make in relation to others is what we measure them by in terms of what kind of people they are.
I'm going to say, I think I've said a few things which are provocative and controversial. I'm going to say another thing which is going to be provocative and controversial, but I feel like I need to say it. And that is one of the disasters of the moment is identity politics, right? So politics, which is simply based on identity, which is, you know, we've got to count the number of people from some particular ethnic group or some racial group into the category, and we've got to do affirmative action. Now, that was all well-meaning, but actually it backfired really badly. And one of my arguments about the Trump universe is that the anti-woke stuff is a reaction against identity politics. And the people who are then the most dangerous the white working class who feel like they've been left behind. So, you know, one of the things we have to do is try and build, and, you know, the word inclusion's come up there. I've kind of tried to define that a little bit. Inclusion isn't treating people the same. But on the other hand, we have to build a politics which is based on our common material interest and our common needs as human beings, but not based on quotas or categorizations based on ethnicity. Now, one of the great things about Australia, and one of the disastrous things about the United States, is that there are 5 types of people in the United States. You know what they are? White, black, Hispanic, Native American, Asian. Have I got through the whole list? That's all there are, right? And what it means is that then everything in the university, everything around employment, everything, you know, the DEI stuff, which has now been reviled, actually was truthfully problematic. And it created a horrific backlash. So, you know, the productive diversity idea and the inclusion idea I was just mentioning are much more carefully modulated ideas, which are actually about everybody. Right?
And it's a common humanity with our differential needs. And that they need
anyhow, you know, identity politics is, I think, calamitous.
So is civic pluralism the response? Is that why you kind of coined it? Because again, in thinking about moving forward, you know, there's been a lot of conversations around social cohesion, around a civic, a body that could respond, and keeping being aware of time. Mary, if I was to ask you and Bill, what is that the sort of platform that maybe we need to be talking about? You talked about multiliteracies, you talked about civic pluralism. Is that the differentiation we're trying to capture?
So we have our common humanity, but our common humanity comes in many, many, many forms. It's not just male and female, for example, or black or white. It comes in so many forms. And what identity politics did was reduce it and reduce it and reduce it, and then try to kind of make amends in some ways that seemed unfair. But if you have a civic pluralism, you recognize common humanity, but the differences that human beings have politics, their attitude, their needs, their health, their whatever, and that your services have to be flexible. As Bill said, it's not one size fits all. You have to be able to be responsive to that diversity, common humanity, common values, as I said, egalitarianism, fair go, ecumenical. You have to have some things that come here that we believe in collaboratively, and we're prepared to negotiate. Right? Rather than saying, well, I'm Syrian and that's important, or I'm Greek and that, you have to face that. And, like that stuff is just an accident of our birth.
Actually,
right?
I'll tell you what, I think I might try and find a way to offend absolutely everybody. In terms of identity politics, the darn pronouns down at the bottom of the email, they, they, he, she, blah, blah, blah. I'll tell you what my pronouns are. My pronouns are we, us. So identity politics is so much that's discursively about defending one's own space, being and about drawing these boundaries, and all of those very simple boundaries are always far too simple.
And we have seen from the American context, when I never thought that would happen, how they've rebounded in obscene ways. They've rebounded in obscene ways because they're easy to poke at.
There's our dog who's
someone poking at you. Yeah.
There's a storm here, and he's terrified of storms. So we've got a thunderstorm outside. So yeah,
absolutely. So just because we've got less than 3 minutes left, but before I close, that question about what gives you hope for Australia's multicultural future? In a minute each. You've got a minute each.
Well, it's still evolving, right? It's still evolving, and it still has good people, right, who do believe in egalitarianism. That's the core for me. That's the core Australian kind of feeling, that we're equal in our difference, and then we set up mechanisms to address that in health, in education, in services. And if that's who we are, and that makes us a new kind of nation, it's not an ethnic nation, right? It's a different kind of nation, and I believe Australia can develop in that direction.
Thanks, Mary. Bill, please don't offend anybody else. I've got to pick up the pieces after this webinar.
No, what can I say? Look, Australia is an interesting place, and for me, excuse me, it's a place of incredible potential. Having been in Asia, having Aboriginal histories there, which are spectacularly interesting histories in terms of in a whole lot of ways, having such a diverse population with so many people from so many parts of the world, all I can say is what an amazing place, but also what tragically unacknowledged successes, and unacknowledged resources, and possibilities that are there which are not being realised. Mary and I got to know Donald Horne pretty well, and Donald Horne wrote The Lucky Country, but of course The Lucky Country was only ever an irony. So the subtitle, which didn't have a subtitle, but what it actually meant was, here we've got this lucky country sitting on all these resources and all these potentials and doing all these things, but it's run by fools. So one of the things is that a lot of the time we've had people who are disappointingly foolish. I mean, I think, if I'm to be bipartisan about this, Keating was a great person. I think Malcolm Fraser was too, to be quite frank. We've had, and anything we think about has to be bipartisan. In other words, if the Conservatives can't think it as well, it's basically not going to happen, essentially.
And part of the services is a public health system. Living in Australia, how much we admire the public health system, and an excellent public education system. The children of immigrants in America do as well as anybody else, in Australia rather. They do well. In America, they don't. Right, there's huge gaps, but Australia.
Gaps in Australia.
No. They have a more flatter kind of a set of outcomes. So they're things to be proud of. They're things to be proud of and to build on. And both the health system and the education system is about addressing all people, but dealing with what their appropriate needs, whether it's in health or within education. And that's, for me, that's the overall principle that should be guiding how we talk about the future and how we respect affinity groups. We need affinity. Like if I find 3 groups, 3 Greeks, I'm excited and I want to be with them and I want to kind of, and that's affinity. Affinity is a good thing, but you know, I wouldn't die for it. You know, you're like, I also feel the same way about other people. So we move in and out of affinity groups and not see them as, you know, iron cages, you know, that we have to
or a threat. Yeah.
Or
Look,
a threat,
I know
yes.
we've gone 1 minute over time, and people I know people are leaving and need to leave. But Bill and Mary, I'm just going to give one final plug. Of course, there's discussions that are just happening about the possibility of a Common Grounds coming to Australia for a conference. We haven't had one for several years. I know that I've been talking to your mob about possibly doing it late 2027 or early 2028. So folks, look out for that, where we can continue to build on the conversations. I'm very heartened by the glass half full, Mary, just as much as I recognise the Greek in me, which is the bugger the lot of them. But listen, I really am so grateful. Never enough time, but thank you. And look, at a time to all of you around the room as you start to sort of head back to what I know is the daily grind. Can I thank each of you? Can I thank each of you? Because it is a time when a lot of these ideas are being contested and undermined. The fact that you turn up, show up, and you still come to these kinds of conversations is such a testament to the brilliance of our settlement sector. Always grateful to you. Mary and Bill, one final thank you so much. Give Apollo the biggest kiss. I miss having him in my bed. A dog, folks. Apollo is the dog. So thank you all. Go well, all of you. Mary and Bill, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
We love you.
Well done, Maria.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Go well.